My name is Catherine Babayan. For those of you who don't know me, I see one or two new faces. I'm the director of the Armenian Studies program, and I am pleased to welcome Arman Grigoryan back to the Armenian Studies program. Arman was here 8 years ago?
Yes.
Less than a decade ago, as a Munungian postdoctoral fellow, and then left us very successfully. That's exactly how we want our postdocs to leave us, with a job at Lehigh University in the Department of International Relations, where he is currently an assistant professor. Arman is a political scientist by training, having earned his PhD from Columbia University in 2008. First educated in Yerevan, where he received his BA with honors from Yerevan State University, he went on to study at the University of Chicago and then at Columbia. A specialist in international relations theory, in nationalism, in ethnic conflicts and minority state relations, genocide and game theory. His region of focus is primarily the Caucasus and the Balkans. Arman's recently edited book, 2008, Armenia's 18. Yeah, you were here in 2008. Armenia's future, the relations with Turkey and the Karabakh conflict, is a curated selection of Levon Ter-Petrossian's articles, speeches, and interviews dealing with the Armenian-Turkish relations, with the Karabakh conflict, and the future of Armenian statehood. The volume is in fact an archive, that's what I would call it, of the first president of the independent Armenia, who I'd like to note is also a medieval Middle East historian, and these two actually are rare combinations. As Arman writes in his introduction, this volume is not about a singular perspective of a politician. Neither is it a memoir that tries to justify controversial decisions made during his 7-year tenure as president. Rather, it is a resource that allows historians to trace critical challenges and tensions that have animated Armenian politics in the last 3 decades. In short, it archives the content of debates with opponents in Armenia about why Armenia needs to normalize its relations with Turkey and to settle the Karabakh conflict. And I would just add that actually the way you've curated it, which I think is a very smart way of narrating a history itself without really doing that, so allowing your audience to follow the logic of the archive, but also to come up with their own conclusions. The volume is an attempt, moreover, to debunk the myths surrounding the conflict in Karabakh, myths that circulate in the Western media and in the academy that understand it as an ethnic conflict, highlighting the irrationality of nationalism and victimization as a peculiar Armenian interpretation of its own history, as victims of Turks and their ethnic kin, the Azeris. Armenians, and I would add also their ethnic rivals, the Turks, are cast as homogeneous entities, devoid of any sense of political pragmatism and forever entangled in a web of hatred and hostility. Today, you will hear more about Arman Grigoryan's interpretation of Levon Ter-Petrossian's presidential archive. Please join me in welcoming Arman Grigoryan.
Thank you very much, Professor Babayan. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be back in Michigan. I had a really exceptional year as a postdoc here in the academic year 2010-2011. I'm very, very happy to be back. And at the risk of sounding like I'm pandering, I think this is a unique and very special program among all Armenian studies programs that I'm aware of, because this is particularly open to diverse views and ideas, and also it's particularly open to different foci as represented by the works of its faculty and several generations of its postdoctoral fellows. And it is no coincidence that I have been invited to present, to make this presentation in Michigan. This is also a testament to the openness and the curiosity that characterizes this program. Not too many other programs would be likely to host me because Levon Ter-Petrossian is not a particularly popular politician in the diaspora, and and unfortunately that's also true for a lot of the intellectual centers of the diaspora, including some of the Armenian studies programs. So again, I want to congratulate you on your openness and your willingness to see different perspectives, and I want to thank you for the invitation. So, why did I decide to curate this project? Why did I suggest that we translate some of the works of Levon Ter-Petrossian, some of his speeches, articles, and interviews into English and publish it for the English-speaking audience? As Catherine Babayan mentioned in her introduction, the purpose was twofold. First was my first goal was to make Levon Ter-Petrossian's writings on these particularly controversial issues, namely the Armenian-Turkish relations and the Karabakh conflict, available to the English-speaking Armenian audiences in the United States and elsewhere, so they could have an unmediated access to his ideas and to his works, so they can make up their own minds without paying attention to a lot of the noise and a lot of the controversy that surrounds his ideas and a lot of the mythology that surrounds his ideas. But that's not the only reason. The second reason was because it is quite remarkable how slanted and how detached from the actual reality, the actual experience of those years, the Western scholarship is about Ter-Petrosyan and about Armenian politics of the time. So this is another target audience, and I think the material that is made available in this volume is going to be very useful for correcting a lot of the myths that also are present in the Western scholarship, and I'll talk about that more toward the end of my talk. So how should I organize the presentation? I've been thinking about this and I couldn't make up my mind. And probably for the ease of exposition and for efficiency, it is best to highlight some of the most common accusations and myths about Ter-Petrosyan and his era, and go over these accusations and I don't want to say respond to them, but discuss them in the context of what is available in this book. Now, the risk of this, of course, is to sound like an apologist, to sound like I'm here defending a politician that I like, and to act like Ter-Petrosyan's advocate and lawyer. That's not the purpose of my presentation. I also don't think he needs a lawyer or he needs my defense. What he has done and said stand on their own feet, and that's not a necessary exercise. But as I said, I think for expositional ease and efficiency, that's probably a way to approach it. Now, let me point out that Ter-Petrosyan was not just a politician. Again, as Professor Babayan mentioned, he is a professional historian, and in his previous life, he was an academic. He was a scholar in the Museum of Ancient Manuscripts. So he was also a thinker. He evolved into a political thinker, and he published many important articles, and he gave many important speeches on issues relevant to interpreting certain very controversial aspects of Armenian history. So he was not just a politician, he was also an important political thinker. He was a particularly articulate and influential spokesperson for a political vision. That in fact had been maturing in Armenia for some time in the late Soviet period. I mean, this is another myth that I would like to correct. I don't know if I say anything about that in the introduction, and this is something that Professor Syuni will relate to, the kind of interesting transformations in political thinking and the form of Armenian the kind of Armenian nationalism that developed in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. There are things about that in Professor Syuni's book, Looking Toward Ararat, which I also highly recommend. So this was not just a very charismatic, intelligent politician who could manipulate the masses, who could convince the masses in certain approaches and ideas. The masses were ready to hear what Ter-Petrosyan had to say. There had been a very long process of maturation of some of these ideas, and I should make it more specific by pointing out that those ideas were kind of implicit criticisms of the traditional Armenian nationalist narrative. And I can actually attest to it personally. I was a student at the Yerevan State University already in 1984. And the kind of conversations we were having challenging the traditional Armenian nationalist narrative, relations with Turkey, the role of Russia, the role of Armenia as a Russian garrison, that sort of stuff was being talked about among 17, 18-year-old kids who were students at the Yerevan State University 4 years before the Karabakh movement. So this is not just about Ter-Petrosyan. This is about an era. This is about an intellectual and ideological process that was taking place in Armenia for quite some time. So they as I said, these ideas were primarily criticisms and doubts expressed about some of the cherished assumptions of the Armenian nationalist narrative. And even though the Karabakh movement started with those traditional nationalist, with the assumptions of the traditional nationalist narrative, very quickly when certain goals of the Karabakh movement and certain hopes of the Karabakh movement were frustrated, this thing exploded into the ideological scene, and people started articulating these ideas. And in fact, Ter-Petrosyan was not the first to articulate them. The first very important piece that was written, and it is still important, although I think people don't talk about it nearly enough, was an article by Rafael Ishkhanian published in 1989 in Harach, in fact. It was called The Law of Excluding the Third Force, and by force he meant the third power, the third party. And in it, Ishkhanian argued that all the tragedies and the problems of Armenia's history are due to the fact that we've had unrealistic aspirations and conflicts with our neighbors, and in order to achieve our goals, we've relied on third parties, on great powers, and that has generated unnecessary conflicts with our neighbors. And then we've been complaining about being betrayed by third parties. So I think Ishkhanian actually exaggerated quite a bit. He gave too much agency to the Armenians with respect to the tragedies, to the tragic events of their history, and not enough to their adversaries. But the mere fact that such an article could be published in 1989 with such a critical view of Armenian history, and and his tone was as interesting as the content of the article, with such a trenchant critique of the traditional narrative, is quite remarkable. So I'm telling you this to point out again that there was an intellectual process of ideological evolution in Armenia that cannot be simply reduced to Ter-Petrosyan's charisma, Ter-Petrosyan's own powers of persuasion, and his preferences. Are these debates still relevant? I think they are relevant because many of the questions that were being debated at the time remain unresolved. They are relevant also because even though they are unresolved, quite a few people prefer to brush them under the carpet. They just, the kind of political discourse that you observe in Armenia today, unfortunately, even after what we are calling the Velvet Revolution, I think that leaves much to be desired. And also, some people erroneously think that the debate has been resolved in their favor. Ter-Petrosyan and company have been proven wrong about their analysis of Armenian history and what was possible to achieve in terms of the relations with their neighbors. So what was exactly the vision? What are the details of the vision I'm talking about? It was actually quite simple. The first postulate of that vision that was being articulated in the late 80s and which eventually became kind of the ideological platform of the Armenian national movement. This is what the Karabakh movement was renamed a few months after the start of the Karabakh movement. So the first postulate was that Armenia should strive to resolve its problems with its neighbors. It is imperative for Armenia, in order for it to survive in this neighborhood and to prosper, it has to resolve its conflicts with its neighbors. The related postulate was that Armenia should rely on its own means. It should not seek third-party support in dealing with the conflicts with its neighbors. It should rely on its own means, on its own resources to achieve the solution. So the idea was that Armenia should not have unrealistic goals that are beyond its means and its capacity, which would then require reliance on third parties. The second postulate, which may seem unrelated to the first, is that Armenia should strive to become a normal state. And this was a very commonly used terminology, not only in Armenia. Yeltsin actually was using that terminology too, and Russian liberals were using that terminology to kind of contrast their political views with the traditionalist Russian nationalist narratives dating back to the Slavophiles, etc., which always assumed, and the debate in the 19th century between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers, and the debate was whether Russia should become just another state following the Western Enlightenment model, or whether Russia should have a special mission, right? And Yeltsin and company were using the term normal state to kind of express their adherence to the vision of an Enlightenment normal liberal state. And this was pretty much the same idea expressed in Armenia. Armenia should become a liberal state. The state should be the kind of institution that provides security for its citizens, and it should not have a special mission beyond what its citizens tell it what the mission is. So it should be a normal liberal democracy, and its primary goal should be to create conditions for the prosperity and the security of its citizens. Now, I pointed out that these two may seem unrelated, but in fact, they were related, and they were closely related, and sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, proponents of the normal state idea argued that it would be impossible, in fact, if Armenia adheres to the traditionalist narrative. It would be impossible if Armenia fails to resolve its conflicts with its neighbors, most importantly, the conflict with Azerbaijan, but also the normalization of the Armenian-Turkish relations. Now, I think it would be also useful to point out what the traditional narrative was, or at least the elements that this new ideology or new platform was rejecting. I'm probably going to use interchangeably the term traditionalist narrative and the Armenian cause. They're probably not the same thing, but they have considerable overlaps. So this new idea was a rejection, an explicit rejection of the Armenian cause. And they rejected it because they argued that subscribing it means unending hostility with the neighbors, It means Armenia will remain forever a strategic appendix for some great power with all of the attendant consequences. And by the way, I should mention here that as part of this new intellectual ferment, there were a lot of ideas and a lot of conversation implying that actually what happened to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, at least in part, was due to relying on third parties and inviting interventions and not dealing with the Ottomans directly. Again, I mean, one can quibble with the logic of these statements, but the fact that these arguments existed itself, I think, is very interesting. The third argument they made was that it is completely unrealistic anyway, the Armenian cause. If it had any realism in the past, where Russia was a growing expansionist power, and Russia is usually the great power that Armenians saw as simultaneously their protector and the agent of their revisionist aspirations. I mean, Russia was a declining state. It was not doing particularly well economically. There was no evidence whatsoever that Russia intended to resume its expansionist drive toward the warm waters. So what are we really talking about here? Why are we keeping this chimerical idea, given that the third party who is going to pull out our chestnuts out of the fire is in no mood and position to do it anyway. The other thing was that really what is a more real threat to the future of Armenians and Armenia is the continued existence of the Soviet Union and the continued existence of Armenians as a community, as a subordinate community in the Soviet Union. I remember in the 70s and 80s, in particular, in Armenia and Georgia, there was a lot of consternation about the assimilationist policies of the Soviet Union, the proliferation of Russian language schools, etc. And I mentioned Rafael Ishkhanyan. Rafael Ishkhanyan was also a big advocate of education in the Armenian language, and he was very, very worried about the assimilationist drive of the Soviet education system. So it wasn't just the assimilationist problem, but anyway, so continued existence in this declining empire was not in the interests of Armenia. Now, one important element in the traditionalist narrative was that no matter what Armenians do, right, so it's not like the problem was Armenian revisionism against Turkey or Azerbaijan. The problem is actually the ideology and the politics of pan-Turkism, and the Armenian interpretation of that idea was that Turks and their cousins, Azeris, are after eradicating Armenians in that part of the world. The conflicts that they have had with Armenians are not about politics, conceived of in normal terms. This is an existential conflict between Turks and Armenians, and the minute that Turks and Azeris get the chance, they are going to eradicate us. And this was also rejected with the argument that in fact the conflict has been political, it has been about politics. This is not a conflict of irrational ethnic antagonism and a kind of eliminationist hatred. And also severely criticized was this notion that without Russia, we have no chance of surviving. And the first document actually in this collection is this remarkable document that was written in response to a Zori Balayan article that was written and first read in the Supreme Soviet of Armenia in 1989 and then published as an article in Russia. And in it, Zori Balayan was explaining to the Russians their interests and particularly how much pan-Turkism threatens Russia as well as Armenia and how it's in their best interest to side with Armenians on Karabakh as well as on other issues. And there was a very trenchant response on the part of the ANM, arguing that this is the sort of thing that breaks the spirit of our nation, makes us a subordinate community, and we cannot imagine our independent existence without the protection of the Russian army. And this is utterly wrong. Armenia can be an independent state and negotiate with Turkey and Azerbaijan. Of course, as any state, there may be conflicts and there may be considerations of the balance of power and security, and Armenia can seek allies, but it's one thing to seek allies, it's another thing to say, we're going to be eliminated the minute the Russian army withdraws from here. So these are some of the elements that at the time were being subjected to the most severe criticism. And what is interesting to point out is two things actually I'd like to draw your attention to. First of all, as I said, the Karabakh conflict started with a lot of the elements, with a lot of the assumptions of the traditionalist narrative. There was really genuine hope among the leaders of the first generation of leaders of the Karabakh conflict, or the Karabakh movement, that Russia was going to be sympathetic to these claims, especially now that it's reformed communist or it's Gorbachev, and it's possible to articulate these truths, these obvious self-evident truths. Russians are going to understand that it's both in their best interest and also morally right to side with the Armenians. It didn't take too long, in fact, a couple of weeks, for Armenian hopes to be frustrated on this account. And within a couple of months, a lot of this edifice had collapsed already. But as I pointed out, the Armenian public was ready for this, and there was already a lot of intellectual ferment that was prepared to subject the traditionalist narrative to criticism, and this only helped to catalyze this process. Now, the ANM, of course, was not unified in its rejection of the traditionalist narrative in its entirety. Moreover, it wasn't unified on the idea of building a liberal, normal state. Actually, there was an interesting split in the ANM after they came to power already in 1990, when one of its most important leaders, Vazgen Manukyan, articulated this idea that Armenia should not be, in fact, a normal state. Armenia should be a state with a mission. We have a special role in the world, and he also argued against democracy as something that an unprepared nation cannot handle like Armenians. And this led to one of the most important and deep schisms in Armenian politics at the time, where the ANM split and Vazgen Manukyan and company were removed. However, in 1991, when the elections were held, the first presidential elections, Levon Ter-Petrossian, who had very clearly articulated these ideas, got 83% of the vote. Now, a lot of people argue that, well, it was on the wave of nationalism and on the wave of the Karabakh movement. I don't want to deny that there is some element of truth in it, but I think it cannot be denied that Ter-Petrosyan was unique in his approach of not giving any big promises, in fact, telling certain truths that he knew would be painful to hear, and he didn't even have a campaign in the classical sense of that word. So despite all of that, and despite all the very sharp criticisms that he got from his opponents, he did receive 83% of the vote, which is also an indicator of how popular these ideas and kind of how popular the skepticism about the traditional narrative had become in the Armenian society. Now, how does Karabakh fit in all of this? As I said, the movement started with many of the assumptions of the traditionalist narrative, and it quickly became obvious that these assumptions were faulty. They did not produce the results that a lot of people were hoping that they would. So after those frustrations, the ANM's agenda shifted. So from Karabakh's unification, it became, the agenda included the important points of striving for independence that became part of the platform, and democracy, even before independence. Even Soviet Armenia should go through a process of democratization, which implied basically ending the monopoly of the Communist Party. And of course, the question immediately emerged, what should happen to Karabakh? If Armenia is to become independent, what should happen to Karabakh? And the Karabakh movements, or the ANM's position on this, was that Armenia should seek compromises. The ANM's position was that the bottom line of Armenian Karabakh should be to make sure that Karabakh Armenians are secure physically, and that they're de facto integrated into Armenia. And again, I want to emphasize the word de facto. So beginning from 1990, whenever Ter-Petrosyan was talking to people in Moscow, the idea, the demand, the key demand that the ANM was making on the authorities in Moscow was to restore the authorities in Karabakh, which had been, Karabakh's autonomy had been cancelled by Azerbaijan. Ter-Petrosyan's argument to the authorities in Moscow was, you should restore the authority in Karabakh and you should negotiate with them. But again, the bottom line for Armenians became, we should make sure that Karabakh is secure, and we should make sure that its educational, cultural, economic life is allowed to integrate with Armenia, which didn't necessarily exclude relations with Azerbaijan, but that was the bottom line. As you know, this didn't work. The Karabakh conflict was not resolved peacefully, and it escalated into a war, which ended with an Armenian victory, however, with no political solution and no de jure independence for Armenia. Now, even though Armenia had won the war in 1994 and a ceasefire on favorable terms had been signed, as I said, no political solution was reached. And one of the things that happens to any country or any society is victories expand the victor's appetite. Right? So things that you don't think are possible before victory all of a sudden become natural after victory. And there was a certain escalation of Armenian demands and certain escalation of expectations on the Armenian side that if such a victory was possible, perhaps we can strive for a de jure independence for Karabakh. Ter-Petrosyan came to the conclusion in 1997 that Armenia did not have allies on this issue, and it cannot force such a solution on Azerbaijan, and he endorsed the famous OSCE plan for resolving the Karabakh conflict on a step-by-step basis, and this led to his resignation famously. The major disagreement with his opponents in 1998 was whether Armenia can get a better deal, namely de jure independence. His opponents argued that it would be possible. Whether Armenia should compromise if it was not under pressure to do so. This was one very interesting argument he had with Vazgen Sarkisyan, the defense minister. One of the most interesting documents in this collection is the transcript of the Security Council meeting in January 1998, where Ter-Petrosyan was making the argument that we should endorse the OSCE plan, and Vazgen Sarkisyan, Serge Sarkisyan, and Robert Kochayan were in opposition to this idea. And so this was one of the points that he was making, which is Armenia should compromise when actually it's a negotiating partner. Vazgen Sarkisyan was arguing that it should only compromise when it has to. And Ter-Petrosyan's response was, well, when you're put in that position, you don't compromise, you capitulate. You just make concessions. The related point was whether the status quo, which at the time seemed favorable to Armenia, was sustainable. Whether the trends of development, economic growth, military growth were going to be in Armenia's favor in the visible future. And Ter-Petrosyan argued that we've kind of reached the peak of our power in relation to Azerbaijan, and you actually do want to negotiate and compromise when you're at the peak of your power, not when you start declining. And the fourth important disagreement was whether Armenia can develop without resolving the Karabakh conflict. Now, has he been proven wrong? Because a lot of people argue that he has been proven wrong on a lot of these issues, and I want to address some of these arguments. First of all, Azerbaijan and Turkey did not respond adequately to ANM's and Ter-Petrosyan's conciliatory stance. So this is one of the arguments that the critics make. And there is considerable reason and logic to this. In fact, Turkey did refuse to recognize, it recognized Armenia's independence, but it refused to establish diplomatic relations. And in a very one-sided manner, it kind of created an informal alliance with Azerbaijan, put severe pressure on Armenia, blockade, etc., etc. So one could argue that the expectations, or at least the arguments about pan-Turkism and the unified Azerbaijani-Turkish plans vis-a-vis Armenia, that's what it looks like, right? So why is Turkey behaving in such a one-sided manner? The problem is that what exactly was conciliatory in Ter-Petrosyan's stance, and what should he have done, right? So opponents who make this argument do not provide a counterfactual picture as to what the alternative policy should have been, and also whether that policy should have worked. So should he have abrogated the Kars Treaty, for example? What would have happened if he did abrogate the Kars Treaty? Should he have demanded a return to the Sever Treaty? Should he have recognized Karabakh's independence, right? Or declared a de jure annexation of Karabakh? And what would the consequence of that be at the time? And would the non-conciliatory alternatives have produced better results? I don't think opponents have even made an attempt to answer these questions. Sometimes, of course, they do try to make, they do make such attempts, but it's better if they didn't. Like recently, there is one famous political pundit in Armenia who argued that had we had we annexed Karabakh in 1992, the world would have treated us with more respect. Yeah, while we were asking for grain shipments and kerosene shipments, and we're in the and Armenia's defense, the entire Armenian budget was $300 million. We would teach the world to give us more respect. So these are not really serious conversations, and I haven't heard any serious arguments as to what the alternative policies could have been, and whether those policies would have produced the desired results. Another argument made against Ter-Petrosyan is that hell did not break loose, and a new war did not happen. He had made some predictions in 1998 that there would be a new war if we don't resolve the conflict. So at least in the period immediately following his resignation, there was no war. There was no war, but there has been a low-intensity warfare that has taken the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of young Armenian men as well as Azerbaijani men. The April War of 2016 was a very worrisome sign when Armenia actually lost territory for the first time since 1991, I want to say. There is no question that the balance of power since 1997, 1998 has changed in favor of Azerbaijan. And as a specialist in international relations theory, and I've also worked a lot on bargaining theory, I want to point out that the results of negotiations are usually tied to the balance of power. Everything else is a fluff, basically. It never happens that you get weaker in terms of your capabilities and you get a better deal. I don't know of a single case like that in history, and it is absolutely undeniable that the balance of power has changed since 1998. It is also undeniable that this was predicted quite clearly by Ter-Petrosyan. What also is an argument, an indirect argument against his opponents, is that Serge Sarkisyan actually was quite close to endorsing a deal that was very similar in parameters to the 1997-1998 deal. So I don't want to make claims that are too bold about this, because I wasn't there. I haven't seen those documents. I haven't been present in the negotiations. But there is enough smoke to that fire that there was something serious happening, and Serge Sarkisyan had come quite close to endorsing a proposal for resolving the Karabakh conflict. Another argument, so this is another indirect. This is also evidence against the opponents of Ter-Petrosyan in favor of his position on Karabakh at the time. Another argument is that Armenia actually grew at a pretty rapid pace in the decade after Ter-Petrosyan's resignation. Well, the counter-argument to it is that the growth was not sustainable, as we have seen, and it wasn't simply because of the world financial crisis and all. I mean, there are serious economic questions serious questions that economists have posed about the nature of the economic growth under Koçaryan, whether that model could be the basis for a long-term development. I don't want to spend too much time on it. If you want to unpack it later, we can talk about it. Azerbaijan grew at an even faster pace, right? So in international relations, what matters is relative power, not whether a country has grown in absolute terms. So even if Armenia grew in that period, Azerbaijan has grown at a faster pace, which is what the reason is for the change of the balance of power. Also, neither Robert Koçaryan nor Serge Sarkisyan have recognized Karabakh or annexed it, right? Which is also evidence that it wasn't the treacherous nature of Ter-Petrosyan that was preventing him from doing that stuff. They did not pull out of negotiations. They did not reject. Indeed, they explicitly endorsed the idea of territorial compromise with Azerbaijan. They did make genocide recognition an item in Armenia's foreign policy. So that on that one issue, they did have a policy that was different from Ter-Petrosyan's, and the consequences were not good. The most obvious, tangible consequence of that was the agreement in the Turkish-Armenian protocols that a commission should be created to study the claims about genocide. In other words, it becomes subject to some kind of, intra-governmental or intergovernmental bargaining as to whether genocide had happened or not. And this also had been predicted, by the way, by Ter-Petrosyan, and in one of his speeches he argued that that's why we don't want to put it on the agenda, because then you will have to engage in this kind of negotiation. Koçaryan actually did make a statement recognizing Turkey's territorial integrity at one of the OSCE meetings, if I'm not mistaken. So again, a lot of the very, very angry and very sharp criticisms of Ter-Petrosyan and accusations are strange given this context and given the fact that some of the people who subscribed to these accusations and these claims themselves did not do things that were much different from Ter-Petrosyan. They did not radically depart from the policies that he was pursuing. One other thing I want to address, and I'm going to stop with that, is democracy was not made impossible in Armenia, as Ter-Petrosyan and the ANM were claiming. I remember I talked about this notion that in order for Armenia to become a normal state, it should normalize the relations with its neighbors. It should stop being a strategic extension of another great power. As we know, a few months ago there was a democratic revolution in Armenia. In fact, if you look at the world, Armenia is one of the most hopeful places for democracy today. Democracy is on retreat everywhere except perhaps in Armenia. Now, I want to point out that garrison states and states that are poor perhaps can have spasmodic democratic transitions, but they rarely are sustained as democracies. So if the conflicts are not resolved, if Armenia's economic situation remains as it is, I wouldn't bet on democracy surviving in Armenia. There is just way too much evidence to the contrary in the study of international relations and comparative politics. Now, I promised to also talk about the Western conventional wisdom and why I think it's important to have these documents published in the United States because these conventional wisdom should be challenged. I'm just going to point out what that conventional wisdom is. So the one argument about Ter-Petrosyan is that he was just an ethnic, organic nationalist. Like when you read some of the writings about Ter-Petrosyan in that period, it would look like the ARF had come to power in 1991 in Armenia and not the ARF's most trenchant critic and opponent, right? And the other accusation against him, of course, is that he was not really a Democrat. He falsified the elections of 1996, and he was really a dictator, and this was proven the first time there was a challenge against his authority. You know, there were bad elections in Armenia. Now, I think both accusations are missing a lot of the evidence. I think both are wrong, and I would be happy to talk about some of the details of those accusations and why I think they are wrong in the Q&A. But I have already spoken way too long, and I'm going to stop here. And thank you again.
Thank you, Arman. Are you ready for your questions?
I am.
Okay.
As ready as I'll ever be.
Since I have to run out
Yeah.
and put my money in the meter,
Sure.
I want you to talk about that. That is, years ago, I was chairing a talk by Girard Lebaridian, who you know well, we all know well.
Yes.
And this was my question to him. That is, this moment when they arrest the Dashnak leaders, and then the election and so forth, it seemed that that was the time when things did turn, right? So you seem to have a different view, or maybe you can explain what you were hinting at.
Now, I think democracy started retreating in Armenia right after the ceasefire, after 1994. But I think people are pointing at the wrong target when they are looking at Ter-Petrosyan. Now, first of all, let's talk about the most common accusations, the arrest of Ter-Petrosyan and the closure of the Dashnak newspapers. The most remarkable thing is this article by Nora Dudwick about that period, which has become the basis of a lot of Western scholarship. And what Nora Dudwick is saying in that article is, actually, I have it on good authority, and people even in the opposition are telling me that what the accusations are about the Dashnaks are essentially true. I'm not quoting her directly, but it was, people talk about them having engaged in terrorist activities, and that's not actually untrue. But then she, without explaining why that doesn't matter, she essentially goes on to say, well, this was basically persecution of political opponents. Now, the same is true for a lot of the international institutions and bodies that monitor democracy and human rights. Nobody, to my knowledge, has argued that the accusations against the ARF in 1995 were fabricated. Now, one could quibble about the method of dealing with it, whether it should be by a presidential decree, whether it should be, by some different methodology. But is that really what we're talking about? Is it not true that the accusations against the ARF were legitimate and justified? One other piece of evidence about that. After Ter-Petrosyan resigned and Kocharyan came to power, and Kocharyan essentially became a Dashnak president. I mean, not officially, but he restored Dashnak Tütün, he restored the ARF to the political arena. A lot of the people that had been charged and jailed under that draw case remained in jail. Some of them are still in jail. I mean, how come they weren't released if the cases were fabricated, even though there was a president now in power who was vehemently hostile to Ter-Petrosyan and was trying to get as much Dashnak support as possible. So that's as far as the Dashnak Tütün is concerned, as far as the ARF case is concerned. The closure of the newspapers, it was just the ARF newspapers that were closed. Other newspapers that were, and that kind of happened by implication. Other newspapers that were equally or more critical of Ter-Petrosyan were not touched in 1995. 1996 is a complicated issue because in this case there is the observer mission's claim that that discrepancy, there was something that was corrected in the record, and that discrepancy was too close to the margin of victory. That correction was too close to the margin of victory. That actually is the one evidence or the one claim that international observers have made about the elections of 1996. So have there been falsifications? Probably. Were they centrally, or I mean, no election is clean, as we know, right? A lot of people take local initiative and do things that they think is going to please the bosses and whatever. And I don't rule out that such things have happened in Armenia, in some precincts, by some people, by some local authorities. Was it centrally organized? There is no evidence of that. And I mean, if Ter-Petrosyan was so keen on staying in the president's office, staying in power, it's absolutely remarkable and strange that he would risk his presidency less than 2 years later by endorsing that plan, knowing what a political crisis it was going to generate. Moreover, he rejected a compromise offer by his opponents that he would stay in power in some capacity, and he just refused and resigned and left the president's office. So that doesn't look to me like the behavior of somebody who was interested in dictatorial powers. Finally, this is the most important thing I have to say about the Western criticisms of Ter-Petrosyan as a dictator. Accusations against Ter-Petrosyan as a dictator and articles about Ter-Petrosyan's dictatorial tendencies started appearing in the New York Times in 1994. Way before any of the closure of the ARF, way before the elections of 95, way before the elections of 96. My hypothesis is that Ter-Petrosyan actually was undesirable from the Western perspective because he had developed a closer relationship with Russia. So this I think was the most important issue. He was quite resistant on resolving the Karabakh conflict based on the preferences of the oil companies. Oil had become a major issue and a major lobbying power in the United States at the time. The diaspora's criticisms of Ter-Petrosyan also log-rolled with this process, and it was easier to depict him as a dictator. And there is one thing which I find very interesting. Actually, there was a very strong cognitive dissonance among a lot of Western observers. The guy does say things that are like the things that classical liberals say. He's really a Democrat, but he's not with us. How come, right? So this is a cognitive dissonance. And I think a lot of Western observers decided to correct that dissonance by portraying him as something less than liberal, less than a Democrat. And again, I want to emphasize that this started happening in 1994, not in 95, 96. So that's what makes me suspicious about this narrative in the West about, Ter-Petrosyan, the dictator. Yes?
So you mentioned that Armenia cannot sustain democracy without resolving its conflict. So moving forward from today, in what way do you feel like, or do you think that Armenia can resolve its conflict with its neighbors, therefore to become more prosperous, based on its history?
Okay, so the
Is that okay?
parameters
Okay.
of the negotiations have been in place since 1994, and as I said, they came quite close to signing a deal in 1998. Some of Ter-Petrosyan's powerful opponents inside the government opposed the deal, which led to a political crisis and his resignation. But all the negotiations have been revolved around very similar parameters. Now, the one issue that is the most difficult to resolve is Karabakh's de jure status. So some people on the Armenian side insist that unless Karabakh is either annexed to Armenia or recognized as de jure independent, Karabakh's security cannot be
Can you
guaranteed.
explain de jure?
Meaning it's recognized as a legally recognized state, and de facto is, well, it is a de facto state. Azerbaijan has no control over it, but it's not recognized as such by anybody in the world, right? So de jure independence means membership in the UN. It's a very different kind of legal status, right? So that's what, on the Armenian side, people demand, and they think of it as the most credible guarantee against any future Azerbaijani encroachments. Fair enough. The problem is that this is something that Azerbaijan does not agree and is not going to agree. So the question is whether something can be found which removes this question from the picture and reaches a solution. Right? And I think the negotiating process and the parameters of the negotiations have been moving in this direction and have been revolving around different interpretations of those parameters or different aspects of those parameters. But that's what the solution is going to be. Now let me actually repeat something that I said before. The outcomes of negotiations are never about what you want. They're about what you can get, right? And this is the most tragic aspect of the conversation in Armenia as well as in Azerbaijan and many other places. I mean, Armenians are not unique about this. The conversation for 25, 30 years has been now, oh my God, you don't want Karabakh to be independent or annexed to Armenia? Well, it doesn't matter what you want, right? It matters what you can get. And one of the arguments that Ter-Petrosyan makes in that very famous article that he published in 1997, and it is part of this collection, is, well, we don't have any allies on this issue. We can't force the world to recognize, or Azerbaijan, to recognize Karabakh as independent, all right? Now, if we can't do that, and if the balance of power is going to shift against us, what does it matter if what you want, right? I mean, the Armenians really were hoping to get the Sever deal in 1920 when the Sever Treaty was signed. And in fact, some people understood that this is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. I mean, that treaty was signed, and there was the Wilson borders of Armenia, etc. But some people, including in Armenia, understood that this is not going to happen. And probably the most reasonable thing would be to trade Sever, which the Turkish side cared, Ataturk cared about. You want to trade that with something that you can actually get and keep, right? Kajazmuni talks about this in his memoirs, and I highly recommend reading Kajazmuni's memoirs. And this is one of the most remarkable men in Armenian history. And I think this is the lesson. I mean, at the time, I imagine anybody arguing that, we should just give up on the Sever boundaries was being, crucified and pilloried as a traitor, right? look what they were left with because they went for sever, right? And Kajazmini talks about this as succumbing, the Armenian delegation eventually succumbing to political pressure in Paris, right? And insisting on this, and that was never going to be acceptable to Ataturk. Moreover, nobody was going to force it upon him, right? So what did it matter if you wanted the severed boundaries? What does it matter if you're insisting on de jure annexation or independence being recognized by the world? Nobody's going to recognize it. I mean, if somebody is going to recognize it, great, I'm willing to change my mind. But given the fact that this is not something that you can force upon Azerbaijan or the world, and that the trends in terms of the distribution of power are not moving in a direction that is in your favor, what's the point in talking about what you want? That's just not a serious political conversation as far as I'm concerned. Sir.
I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about to what extent Ter-Petrosyan's ideas enjoy any kind of afterlife or legacy in Armenia today. Besides he made predictions and people didn't listen to them, and now we're living with these bad consequences. And then also, to what extent are those ideas associated with him still, if they do exist? So, like, regardless of how people feel about him as a person or a leader, especially the early stuff he came up with the A&M, does it still have some kind of currency?
Mm-hmm. It's not easy to answer your second question. So in some ways, if you look at the Armenian political discourse, the Levon Ter-Petrossian is not very popular today. Actually, every other person or 2 out of 3 people who open their mouth to say anything political in Armenia today, think it's their duty to say something nasty about Ter-Petrosyan.
It's often about like corruption or something that seems like it's not.
Yeah, they talk about that too. It's not even, well, I mean, yeah, corruption is one of the accusations, which is kind of funny because it's like, Ter-Petrosyan inherited that clean Soviet system and he corrupted it, right? Now, I've grown up in that country. I was there in the 1980s. If anybody tells you they got into the law school without paying a bribe, you can laugh at them, right, in the 80s. I mean, the corruption was so astronomical in the Soviet Union, it's not even funny. So, accusations of corruption, it's there, but it's already boring to even talk about that. I mean, whatever it is, he's not very popular today. I mean, you have to take into account that for 20 years, the media in Armenia has been controlled by Ter-Petrosyan's opponents. They've had the money and the wherewithal to engage in this massive PR campaign of denigrating that period, not just him, but the period as a whole, and his ideas. And also people feel some sense of frustration when he returned to politics in 2008 and failed to displace or unseat the existing regime. Some of it is, frustration. I think most importantly, though, and this is what worries me about the current atmosphere in Armenia and the current velvet revolution in Armenia. For 8 months, we've been in this political turmoil there and have undergone these important changes in Armenia. And none of the really difficult problems of Armenia have been subjected to any serious debate and conversation, including by Nikol Pashinyan. Nobody has really, I mean, when I say nobody, I should point out that some of the people who have nothing to do with power and with making decisions are talking about conquering Nakhichevan, are talking about a Kur-Araxes republic, so expansionist ideas, are talking about how Armenia should recognize Karabakh, well, not recognize, Armenia should annex Karabakh, and the world is just going to cry uncle when Armenia does that, I guess. So you have that unserious, really bizarre discourse. On the part of the authorities, you just don't have anything. I don't know what Pashinyan is thinking about this. One thing that he has said on several occasions is that I'm going to try and restore Karabakh as a party to the conflict, which Robert Kocharyan, in his infinite wisdom, removed, because Karabakh had been recognized as an official party to the conflict in 1994, but and Karabakh's defense minister has signed under the ceasefire, right? So Kocharyan, when he came to power, said, you know, I'm from Karabakh, I'll negotiate on their behalf, which was probably the biggest diplomatic blunder Armenia has committed in the period of its independence. So Pashinyan, I mean, the only interesting thing he has said about Karabakh and how he's going to approach this is that he's going to try and restore Karabakh status. But I don't know how that's going to be possible. I'm not sure that train hasn't left the station. I'm not sure that's not going to generate actually new problems in the sense of the mediators saying, are you pulling out of the current negotiations and what are the consequences of that? So I don't know. But again, I don't think this is an easy situation, and I don't think people are being entirely open and honest about what the prospects are of extending the status quo any further. So some people are now hoping that now that Armenia is democratic, it will have more international support. I don't know what that means, right? So because Armenia is democratic, Germany is going to be less interested in importing oil from Azerbaijan, or is going to endorse an Armenian annexation of Karabakh. What's the evidence of that? One idea is that now that we are fighting corruption and Armenia is going to become strong and economically prosperous, we don't have to fear a further deterioration of our power position. You know, the economic indicators over the last few months are not good, nor have we seen a massive return of people who have left Armenia, migration back. And people, you know, can get excited about, you know, patriotic talk and talk about their desires of what they would like Armenia's borders to be. But when it comes to sending their children to Karabakh to guard the very dangerous border there, they'd rather stay in Los Angeles. One of the most ardent hawks in Armenia has his two sons safely ensconced in Canada. And people actually ask him this question, and he keeps talking, he keeps saying these things, and as if that's not an issue at all. So that's what you want to pay attention to. You know, are people returning to Armenia? Is the economy growing, right? Do we have any international indicators that, you know, the opinion and the positions are shifting in favor of Armenia? I don't have any evidence of that. So yet at the same time, because of this very lengthy period of, I don't want to say brainwashing, but this intense hawkish propaganda, intense arguments equating any compromise solution with defeatism and capitulation, a lot of people just can't normally think about compromises and peace. I mean, it has become anathema to a lot of people. It's a very unpopular idea in Karabakh. Finally, I think it's easier, both psychologically and intellectually, it's easier to say, well, we're controlling this stuff and we're not going to give it up, right? If we give it up, bad things will happen, right? Compared to ideas about, well, if you don't give up, what will happen, and can you create guarantees of Azerbaijan not exploiting the territorial concessions if such concessions were to happen? So this gets into a much more complicated territory, both psychologically and intellectually. So people who are in favor of a compromise solution are at a disadvantage there. Now, having said that, has the A&M's and have the A&M's and Ter-Petrosyan's ideas had any effect? The answer is unquestionably yes. As I pointed out in my talk, even though a lot of people like to criticize him, they've not really challenged a lot of the policies that he had adopted. I mean, they haven't done as good a job of taking those policies to their logical ends and succeeding where he failed. But ultimately, I think on a lot of these issues, as I said, I mean, Kocharyan did not make any territorial claims against Turkey, and you do have a lot of people inside the government and in the deep state of Armenia that still find a lot of the criticisms of the traditionalist narrative in the Armenian cause legitimate and correct. And in that sense, I think the ANM's and Ter-Petrosyan's role cannot be undermined. I think they have left a deep trace on Armenian political thought and Armenian politics.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the wave, right? So to take attention away from just Ter-Petrosyan and to think about, or to wonder about what happened to that wave, right, that he rode on, right?
In 2008?
No, in 1991.
Yeah.
Between 1991 and 1998, right? So if you can sort of track a little bit, I mean, your points of reference are the treaties, the ceasefire, right? Meanwhile, so that's the first part of my question is, what happens to that wave in 7 years, right? Which is a long time when you actually have a lot of excitement about change. And then to think about that in a similar way that Michael's asking about the after effect of Ter-Petrosyan, or the afterlife of Ter-Petrosyan, we have a new generation now. 30 years has passed. They are youth who actually didn't know, were born in the time of Ter-Petrosyan, right? And the independence of Armenia. So this wave of the Velvet Revolution, can one create a longue durée in some way of a relationship between them? Or how do you see, as for me as curious as a historian, I'm trying to see sort of the longer effect of these waves, and how they subside, and what causes the rise again, and the content of it too.
One of the things that happens in those situations of massive transformational crisis is that the ancien regime has demonstrated its incapacity, its bankruptcy, and you're in a very good position to point to their errors, to point to their mistakes, to point to their failures and say, we have to change. We have to adopt a very different position. And that's what was happening in the late 80s with respect to the communists and the first generation of Karabakh movement's leaders, who were hoping that if they really suck up to Gorbachev, he will sign Karabakh away from Azerbaijan to Armenia. So a lot of this stuff was easy to criticize, to target, to point to as problematic. Now, it has to be said, though, that their position and some of their successes, in fact, also created expectations that were not realistic. For example, I mean, this is a very subtle issue, and I've tried to address it in the introduction, in the book, and elsewhere. And also, I alluded to it in my remarks. Now, for some reason, ANM's and Ter-Petrosyan's position was interpreted in the late 80s and early 90s as, we're going to form this brotherly friendship with Turkey. I mean, Turkey is going to immediately recognize the genocide, and there's going to be no problem as soon as we tell Turkey that we don't have any demands, or we're recognizing the status quo. obviously that wasn't the argument necessarily. Even if some people may have suggested such explanations and such expectations and such optimism, the real argument was, well, we can't adopt a revisionist foreign policy vis-a-vis Turkey when we become independent. I mean, first of all, I mean, that would be suicidal. We don't have any allies on that. I mean, if you think Russia is going to endorse such a policy, you must be smoking something. And all of that is true, and that was really what the meat of their argument was, right? And on those issues, they were absolutely, unequivocally right. But it is true that a lot of people psychologically interpreted this as things are immediately going to improve with Turkey, and if it didn't improve, then they were wrong, right? And their opponents also exploited that very, I should say, very dexterously. Now, what happened to the wave? A lot of Ter-Petrosyan supporters get depressed talking about, that period didn't result in achieving all the goals, and Ter-Petrosyan had to resign in the middle of his second term. I look back at that period and I compare Ter-Petrosyan's tenure with the tenures of other presidents in the former Soviet Union, except for the communists who rebranded themselves in Central Asia. And so nobody survived past a year or two. I mean, Ter-Petrosyan survived for a very long time in power. He had enormous achievements, but at the same time, he was a reformer overseeing a process of extremely powerful and difficult transition, compounded by all sorts of additional problems like the earthquake, like the war, like the blockade, and the fact that Armenia's economy was particularly vulnerable because it was basically an appendix of the Soviet defense industry, right? And its economic transformation was going to be a particularly challenging endeavor. So no matter what you say to people, though, I mean, if you tell these things, I mean, all they remember, ordinary people don't engage in this kind of analysis. All they remember is that their children were cold and hungry in the 90s. They had to burn their furniture to heat their homes, and it happened under Ter-Petrosyan's presidency. I mean, there is one irony there as well, which is, God forbid, had bombs fallen on Yerevan, people would realize that the country was at war. As it was, a lot of people didn't, in the end, appreciate that the country was really at war. I mean, partly it was because the Armenian government was saying, we're not at war, it's Karabakh that is at war, and this was also quite nicely exploited by their opponents. But, for all intents and purposes, Armenia was at war too. Its economy had become a war economy, and a lot of the consequences of that war were quite severe for the Armenian economy. So it's not surprising at all that he paid the price. He and his government paid the price for those changes, because all reformers do. That's inevitable. And I think in some ways Ter-Petrosyan and some of his supporters should be surprised by the fact that when he returned in 2008, he was as popular as he was, and he came as close as he did to unseating Serge Sarkisyan, or not allowing Serge Sarkisyan to take over the presidency. So I don't know if that was necessarily a good answer to your question, but yes.
So you kind of touched upon this.
Yeah.
At various points in the talk, but what is the ideal Armenian politician, and what are specific boxes that Armenian politicians have to check in order to to sway voters, and how can this actually predict election outcomes?
Are you asking that question because we have elections soon in Armenia? Huh? No.
Yeah.
I think actually I'm going to give you two answers which may seem like they contradict each other. So the first reaction I have is that the Armenian society is quite fragmented. And answering your question would be impossible because there are very, very different segments of the Armenian public that think of the ideal politician very differently. Now, you might challenge that answer by saying, look, people are predicting this huge victory for Nikol Pashinyan. If anything, Nikol Pashinyan, the problem has become that there is a new cult of personality developing around Nikol Pashinyan. And obviously there is a huge segment or a huge majority of the Armenian public that is in support of Nikol Pashinyan. Now, the reason I wouldn't necessarily endorse that observation or whatever it implies is because I think this is negative support as of yet. By that I mean Nikol Pashinyan is riding on the wave of having successfully seen through the revolution and sent the old regime packing, and that's what people are applauding still. But after he wins the elections on December 9th, and there is very little doubt that he will win, and with a huge margin. As I said, he's going to start governing the country, and he's going to start making very difficult decisions, and no matter who comes to power in Armenia, objectively, the country faces really nasty problems. No matter who comes to power, they are going to make decisions that are going to be unpopular with large segments of the Armenian public, and they're never going to remain as popular as Nikol Pashinyan is today. So if you're asking me what is the ideal politician, in my opinion, Otto von Bismarck.
What?
Otto von Bismarck. He wasn't even a politician, he was a statesman. So I like statesmen, not politicians.
Okay. Any other questions? No?
Well, we will thank you, and we will hope you come back, not a decade later, but sooner.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.